Imagine this. Over 1 million people, trudging through the burning desert, day after day, with only the sky above and the unforgiving ground below. Children cry out in hunger, the elderly stumble under the blistering sun, and women, heavy with child, carry their babies in their arms. Marching through a desolate wasteland with no end in sight. The air is thick with dust, the heat unbearable, yet somehow this massive crowd survives. How did they do it? This is not a scene from a post-apocalyptic novel or a survival story from the edge of the world. No, this is the real journey of the Israelites. More than 1 million people, walking through the desert for 40 years, surviving on nothing but faith, miracles, and divine intervention. Every step they took was a testament to the strength of their spirit, the power of God's guidance, and the unimaginable challenges they faced. But here's the question that haunts me. How did they survive in the desert with nothing but faith? How did a generation of slaves, broken by years of oppression, transform into a mighty nation capable of taking on the world? What was it about the desert that shaped their destiny and, perhaps more importantly, what can we learn from their journey? In the next few minutes, we're going to walk in their footsteps, uncovering not just the miracles that sustained them, but the deeper lessons hidden in their trials. Get ready, because the truth about their journey, about their survival and their transformation, is far more surprising and powerful than you might think. Stay with me, because the story we're about to dive into isn't just ancient history. It's a story that's still relevant to our lives today. So, grab a seat and let's embark on this incredible journey together. The story of the Exodus is one of the most profound and pivotal narratives in the Bible. It is not just the tale of a people escaping slavery, but the story of divine intervention, leadership, and the formation of a new identity for an entire nation. Over 1 million Israelites, including men, women, children, and a diverse group of followers from different nations, walked through the wilderness, guided by the hand of God. Their journey from the land of Egypt to the promised land of Canaan was a miraculous one, filled with trials and triumphs, divine provision, and challenges to faith. But the real question that arises is, how did they survive? How did over 1 million people, in the most unforgiving of environments, live for 40 years with nothing but faith in God's promises? When we first think of the Exodus, we may envision the dramatic scene at the Red Sea, with waters parting to allow the Israelites to escape Pharaoh's army. But this event, as extraordinary as it was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would shape the people of Israel for generations to come. To understand the significance of their journey, we must delve deeper into the logistics and the immense challenges that the Israelites faced as they traversed the desert. First, we must recognize the sheer scale of the Exodus. Exodus 12 verse 37 tells us that over 600,000 men left Egypt, not counting women and children. Some estimates suggest the total number of people involved in the Exodus could have easily surpassed 1 million. Picture that for a moment. A vast column of humanity stretching for miles across the desert. If they were to walk in a single file line, it would span more than 300 kilometers. To put it in perspective, the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C. is approximately 225 miles, and even that would be a long journey for such a massive crowd. But these people were not walking on a paved road with modern amenities. They were crossing a harsh, unforgiving desert, where the sun beat down relentlessly, and the resources were few and far between. They had nothing but their faith in God to guide them. The Exodus wasn't just a physical journey. It was a spiritual one. After years of slavery, these people were being led into a new life, a new identity as the chosen people of God. Yet, as we know, the journey was not an easy one. It was fraught with difficulties and moments of doubt. The people, having just escaped the harsh oppression of Egypt, now faced the harshness of the desert, and their faith was put to the test time and time again. The first major trial came when they were 3 days into their journey and found themselves without water. Exodus 15 verses 22 to 25 recounts how the people complained bitterly to Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" They had no idea how they would survive in such a desolate place, and their faith in God was already beginning to waver. This is the first of many moments where the Israelites would face challenges that would shake their faith. It's easy for us to look back and think, How could they doubt after all they had seen? But think about it for a moment. They had just witnessed God's mighty power in the form of 10 devastating plagues, culminating in the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. Yet, within days of experiencing these mighty acts, they found themselves questioning their survival. In the face of their despair, God provided them with a miracle. He showed Moses a tree, and when Moses threw the tree into the bitter waters of Marah, the waters became sweet and drinkable. This was not just a miracle of provision. It was a lesson in trusting God even when circumstances seemed hopeless. And this was only the beginning. Over the next 40 years, the Israelites would see countless miracles, all of which were meant to teach them about faith, obedience, and the importance of trusting in God's provision. After the miracle at Marah, the Israelites continued their journey deeper into the desert. And just a few weeks later, in Exodus 16, we see the first instance of their hunger. The people again grumbled against Moses, saying, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." The complaint was not just about food. It was about their discontent with the new life they were being led into. They longed for the familiarity of their old lives, even though those lives were marked by oppression. It's a striking reminder of how often we cling to the past, even when the present holds something better, simply because the past is familiar. In response to their complaints, God provided them with manna from heaven. This wasn't just any ordinary food. It was a supernatural provision, something that had never been seen before. The manna would fall each morning, and the people could gather just enough for each day. It was a test of obedience. They were told not to store it up for the next day, except for on the sixth day, when they would gather twice as much to prepare for the Sabbath. This daily provision was a powerful lesson in dependence on God. It was not just about food. It was about trusting God to meet their needs each day. But again, the people struggled with obedience. Some of them tried to keep the manna overnight, and it became foul. This was a clear message. God wanted them to trust Him daily, not to rely on their own efforts or on the things of the past. But the Israelites were not alone in this journey. Exodus 12 verse 38 tells us that a mixed multitude also left Egypt with the Israelites. This group included Egyptians, Nubians, Libyans, and other foreigners who had seen the plagues and the power of Israel's God and decided to follow them. This is significant for a couple of reasons. First, it shows that the message of God's power and deliverance was not just for the Israelites. It was for the world. The Exodus was a sign to the nations that the God of Israel was the one true God, capable of delivering His people from oppression. Second, it tells us that the people who left Egypt were not a homogeneous group. There were various ethnicities, backgrounds, and cultures represented in this journey. The Israelites were not just escaping Egypt. They were forming a new community, a new nation with God at the center. As the Israelites continued their journey, they were organized in a way that reflected both military discipline and spiritual order. Numbers 2 gives us a detailed account of how the tribes were arranged around the tabernacle, with each tribe positioned in a specific location to create a well-ordered camp. This organization was no accident. It was a reflection of God's desire for His people to live in harmony and unity. Each tribe had its own flag, symbolizing their distinct identity, yet they were all united under the banner of God's presence. This structure, with the tabernacle at the center, was a visual representation of God dwelling among His people. The movement of the Israelites through the desert was not just about physical survival. It was about spiritual formation. Every aspect of their journey was designed to teach them something about God's character, about the nature of faith, and about what it meant to be His people. The logistics of the journey, the daily gathering of manna, the movement of the tribes, the organization of the camp, were all part of a much larger spiritual narrative. God was not only leading them out of Egypt, He was leading them into a new identity, a new way of life, and a new relationship with Him. The journey of the Exodus was filled with miracles, yes, but it was also filled with challenges. The Israelites faced physical hardships, emotional turmoil, and moments of intense doubt. Yet through it all, God provided for them, guided them, and taught them. He led them through the wilderness not just to bring them to the promised land, but to transform them into a people who would reflect His glory to the world. In our modern world, we may not face the physical challenges that the Israelites did, but we face our own wildernesses. We encounter times of doubt, moments of fear, and struggles that seem insurmountable. The story of the Exodus serves as a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, God is with us. He provides for us, guides us, and transforms us through the trials we face. The journey of the Israelites is not just a historical account. It is a story of faith, hope, and resilience that speaks to us today. As we continue to explore this remarkable journey, we will see how the Israelites' faith was tested and how they grew through their challenges. But before we dive deeper into those lessons, let us reflect on the miracle of the Exodus itself. It wasn't just about the physical acts of deliverance. It was about the spiritual transformation of a people. And that, my friends, is where the real power of the Exodus lies. After the miraculous escape from Egypt, the Israelites were thrust into a vast, barren wilderness. It was a land of desolation where water was scarce, food was non-existent, and the sun blazed down relentlessly on the millions of weary travelers. Yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, this period in the desert was not just about survival. It was about transformation. The Israelites were not simply walking through a physical desert. They were walking through a spiritual desert, a place where their faith would be tested, their weaknesses exposed, and their reliance on God would be cultivated. The wilderness was not a mere backdrop to their journey. It was the proving ground where the future of the nation would be shaped. When we read the account of the Israelites' 40 years in the desert, it is easy to focus solely on the miraculous events, like the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of manna, the water from the rock, and the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. These are spectacular events that demonstrate the power and faithfulness of God. But beneath these miracles lies a deeper, often overlooked truth. The wilderness was a time for the Israelites to learn to trust in God alone, to develop true faith in Him, and to understand their need for transformation. And that transformation, as we will see, was far more difficult than anyone could have imagined. Faith, in its purest form, is not just about believing in God's existence or acknowledging His power. Faith is about trust. It is about trusting God even when we cannot see the way forward. It is about believing in His promises, even when circumstances tell us otherwise. And for the Israelites, this was not an easy lesson to learn. They had just experienced the miracle of their deliverance from Egypt. Yet as soon as they were faced with adversity, they began to grumble and question God's faithfulness. We see this in Exodus 15 verse 24, where the people cry out, "What shall we drink?" after finding themselves without water. They had barely left Egypt, and already their faith was shaken. How often do we, too, find ourselves doubting God's provision when faced with challenges? We are no different from the Israelites, quick to forget the ways God has provided for us in the past when the next trial comes. But this was only the beginning. The wilderness was full of tests, and each test was an opportunity for God to teach the Israelites about the kind of faith He required. In Exodus 16, we see the people's hunger taking center stage. They again complained, saying, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full." This wasn't just a simple complaint about food. It was a declaration that they preferred the familiar, even if it was slavery, to the unknown, even if it was freedom. They longed for the food they had in Egypt, failing to see that they were being led to something far greater. In our own lives, how often do we fall into the trap of longing for what we once had, even when it was less than God's best for us? God's response to their grumbling was both practical and spiritual. He provided them with manna, a substance that appeared every morning like dew on the ground. Manna was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and it provided the nourishment they needed to survive. But the manna was not just about physical sustenance. It was a lesson in dependence on God. Every day, they had to trust that God would provide for them again the next morning. There was no storing up for the future. They could only gather enough for the day. This was a powerful lesson in daily faith. God was teaching them to rely on Him for their daily needs, not to store up provisions in their own strength. How often do we try to control our own circumstances, relying on our own resources and abilities instead of trusting God for each day. The Israelites' journey through the desert wasn't just about what they ate or drank. It was about learning to trust God for everything. It was about being shaped and molded into a people who would depend on Him for all things. And that transformation wasn't easy. In fact, it was painfully difficult. In Numbers 11, we see the people growing weary of the manna, and once again, they complained, saying, "Who will give us meat to eat?" Their dissatisfaction with the provision of God is a reflection of the human tendency to want more than what God has given us, even when what He provides is more than sufficient. The people longed for the food of Egypt, forgetting that Egypt was a place of bondage, not abundance. God responded to their complaints by sending quail, a lot of quail, but His response came with a warning. While the Israelites ate the quail, a plague struck them, showing that God would not tolerate their disobedience and lack of gratitude. This moment is a critical turning point in the story of the Israelites' journey. The issue wasn't just about food. It was about their hearts. They had been freed from slavery, but they had not yet been freed from the mindset of slavery. They had not yet learned to trust God fully, to rely on Him for their every need. They still had the mindset of those who had been oppressed and controlled by Pharaoh. The wilderness was where God would change that mindset. It was where He would transform them from a people who had been slaves into a nation that would serve as a light to the world. It's worth noting that the wilderness was not just a place of testing. It was also a place of leadership development. Moses, the leader of the Israelites, was also being tested. In Exodus 18, we read about Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who saw Moses sitting alone to judge the people from morning to evening. Jethro advised Moses to appoint leaders over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens to help bear the burden of leadership. This advice was not just about delegation. It was about building a system of leadership that would help the people grow and flourish. Leadership in the wilderness was not about Moses being the sole leader. It was about raising up others who could share the responsibility of guiding the people. The wilderness, in many ways, was a school for leadership, where Moses would learn to rely not only on God but also on the people He had called him to lead. One of the most striking aspects of the Israelites' journey through the desert is the recurring theme of rebellion. Time and again, the people grumbled against Moses and God, questioning their leadership and their faithfulness. In Numbers 12, we read about Miriam and Aaron's rebellion against Moses, criticizing him for marrying a Cushite woman. What started as a personal complaint quickly turned into a challenge to Moses' authority and, by extension, God's plan for His people. The punishment for Miriam was swift and severe. She was struck with leprosy. God's response to Miriam's rebellion is a reminder of the seriousness with which He views disobedience. But even in the midst of His discipline, God showed mercy, as Moses interceded on her behalf, and she was healed after 7 days. The story of Miriam's rebellion is a powerful reminder of the importance of unity and submission to God's appointed leadership. In the desert, where resources were scarce and the challenges were great, division could have easily led to disaster. God, in His wisdom, used the wilderness not only to test the faith of the people, but also to teach them the importance of unity and obedience. The Israelites needed to learn that their survival depended not just on their individual faith, but on their collective faith as a community. In times of hardship, it's easy to let personal grievances and discontentment divide us. But God calls us to unity, to submit to His leadership and to trust in His plan, even when we don't understand it. As the Israelites journeyed through the desert, they experienced both miracles and hardships. They saw God's provision, but they also encountered the consequences of their rebellion. Yet, despite the challenges, God remained faithful. He continued to guide them, to provide for them, and to transform them into a nation that would one day take the promised land. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 40 years in the desert for the Israelites to become the people God had called them to be. And that transformation required faith. Faith in God's provision, faith in His leadership, and faith in His promises. The wilderness was not just a place of physical survival. It was a place of spiritual growth. It was where the Israelites learned to trust in God's provision, to depend on Him daily, and to be transformed into the people He had called them to be. And while the wilderness was a time of testing, it was also a time of preparation. God was not only preparing the Israelites for the promised land. He was preparing them for their future as a nation that would serve as a light to the nations. It was in the desert that the foundations of the nation of Israel were laid, and it was in the desert that the Israelites were transformed from a group of former slaves into the people of God. As we reflect on the Israelites' journey through the desert, we can't help but see parallels in our own lives. We all face wilderness seasons, times when life feels desolate, when our faith is tested, and when we long for something more. But the wilderness is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of transformation. It is in the wilderness that our faith is deepened, our dependence on God is solidified, and our character is refined. Just as God was with the Israelites in the desert, so He is with us in our own wilderness seasons, guiding us, providing for us, and transforming us into the people He has called us to be. The journey of the Israelites through the desert was not merely a story of survival and faith. It was a process of purification and transformation. As we explored in the previous sections, their time in the wilderness was marked by miracles, provision, and constant testing. But amidst these extraordinary events, another, often more sobering, theme emerges: divine justice. While God's love, mercy, and provision were evident in every step of their journey, so too was His unwavering commitment to holiness, obedience, and justice. The wilderness became the ultimate testing ground not just for their faith, but for their obedience to the commands of the Almighty. In many ways, the Israelites' struggle wasn't just about surviving in the desert. It was about understanding the severity and the cost of disobedience to God. Throughout their journey, we see the clear consequences of rebellion, murmuring, and failing to trust in God's plan. The severity of these consequences can be difficult to comprehend, especially for modern readers. We live in a world that often tolerates disobedience and treats sin lightly, but the story of the Israelites in the desert provides a striking contrast. God's justice in the wilderness was swift and decisive. It was not arbitrary or cruel. It was a reflection of His holiness and His desire for His people to be a holy nation, set apart for His purposes. One of the most memorable stories of divine justice comes from the incident with the golden calf in Exodus 32. After Moses went up the mountain to receive the law from God, the people grew impatient. They had been waiting for days, and their faith began to falter. They turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded that he make them a god they could worship. In their desperation, they took their gold and melted it down, fashioning a calf, a false idol, to represent the God they had once known in Egypt. This act of idolatry was not just a lapse in judgment. It was a direct violation of the first and second commandments that God had given them. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourselves a graven image. The Israelites had seen God's mighty acts, from the plagues in Egypt to the parting of the Red Sea. Yet in their impatience and lack of trust, they chose to turn back to the very things that had kept them in bondage. When Moses descended from the mountain and saw what had happened, his anger was kindled, and he smashed the tablets containing the 10 Commandments. The consequences of this idolatry were swift and severe. Moses called for those who were on the Lord's side to come to him, and the Levites responded. He commanded them to take their swords and strike down the idolaters, and about 3,000 people were killed that day. This was a shocking and brutal judgment, but it was necessary to restore order and to show the gravity of turning away from God. In Exodus 32 verse 35 we read, "So the Lord plagued the people because they made the calf, the thing which Aaron made." This moment of judgment shows us that God does not tolerate disobedience, especially when it involves turning away from Him to follow idols. The golden calf incident serves as a stark reminder of the danger of idolatry, not just in a literal sense, but in how we can allow anything to take God's rightful place in our lives. In today's world, our golden calves might not be made of metal, but they can be anything that we place above God. Money, power, relationships, success, or even our own desires. Idolatry is not just about worshiping false gods. It's about placing anything before the one true God, and the consequences of that are just as severe. God desires our wholehearted devotion, and any division of our affections compromises our relationship with Him. While the golden calf incident was a moment of catastrophic disobedience, it was not the only time that the Israelites experienced the consequences of their rebellion. In Numbers 12, we find the story of Miriam and Aaron's challenge to Moses' leadership. Miriam, Moses' sister, and Aaron, his brother, both criticized Moses for marrying a Cushite woman. Though this may seem like a minor family dispute, it was, in fact, a challenge to God's appointed authority. Miriam and Aaron were questioning whether Moses alone had the right to lead the people, and in doing so, they were questioning God's wisdom in appointing Moses as the leader. The punishment for this rebellion was swift. Miriam was struck with leprosy, and she was forced to stay outside the camp for 7 days before being restored. Aaron was spared the same fate, but he acknowledged his wrongdoing and sought forgiveness. God's justice here was not about personal vengeance. It was about maintaining the purity of his leadership and the unity of his people. Miriam's punishment was severe, but it served as a warning to the entire community about the consequences of questioning God's authority. This story also shows us that no one, not even Moses' closest family members, was above God's law. In God's kingdom, there is no room for rebellion or dissent against his appointed authority. The theme of divine justice continues in the story of Korah's rebellion, found in Numbers 16. Korah, a Levite, and his followers, including Dathan and Abiram, challenged Moses and Aaron's leadership, questioning why they were the ones who had been chosen to lead the people. Korah and his followers demanded equal authority, claiming that the entire congregation was holy and that Moses and Aaron had set themselves above the people. This challenge to God's leadership was not just a personal grievance. It was an attempt to destabilize the entire system of governance that God had established for the Israelites. The consequences were terrifying. God told Moses to tell the people to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and as they did, the earth opened up and swallowed them whole, taking their families, possessions, and everything that belonged to them. The ground closed back up, and they were gone, consumed by the earth. This was followed by fire coming from the Lord and consuming the 250 men who had offered incense in rebellion. The earth and fire, both symbols of God's judgment, served as a powerful reminder of the seriousness of challenging God's chosen leadership. This moment of judgment is one of the most dramatic in the entire Bible, and it leaves us with a deep sense of awe and reverence for God's holiness. Korah's rebellion illustrates that God's justice is not only about punishing sin but also about preserving order and the integrity of his will. Disobedience is not something that God takes lightly, and when his people rebel against his plans, they risk incurring his wrath. But even in the midst of his judgment, God's mercy is evident. He provided a way for the Israelites to be spared the full wrath that they deserved by allowing Moses to intercede on their behalf. Another instance of divine justice is found in Numbers 21, where the Israelites once again murmured against God and Moses, complaining about the lack of water and food. In response to their complaints, God sent fiery serpents to bite the people, and many died. When the people acknowledged their sin and begged Moses to intercede, God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Anyone who had been bitten and looked at the serpent would live. This act of divine justice was also a powerful lesson about repentance, obedience, and the grace of God. The Israelites had sinned by complaining, but God's mercy was extended to them through the provision of the bronze serpent, symbolizing the healing and restoration that comes when we turn back to God in repentance. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding divine justice is reconciling the severity of God's judgments with his nature as a loving and merciful God. How do we make sense of the fact that God, in his perfect holiness, brings judgment upon his people for their disobedience? The answer lies in understanding that God's justice is not arbitrary or harsh. It is rooted in his holiness and his desire for his people to reflect his character. The consequences of sin, whether in the form of physical death or spiritual separation, are not just punishments. They are the natural outcomes of turning away from God's ways. God's justice is a reflection of his holiness, and his desire is for his people to be holy as he is holy. When we choose to rebel against him, we choose to live outside of the blessings and protection that he offers. But God's justice is not without hope. In the wilderness, as we have seen, God continually provided a way for the Israelites to be restored, even in the face of their disobedience. Whether through Moses' intercession, the bronze serpent, or the forgiveness extended after the golden calf incident, God's grace was evident even in the midst of his judgment. His ultimate desire was always to bring his people back to himself, to teach them the importance of obedience and faith, and to restore them to a place of blessing. In our own lives, we too must understand the cost of disobedience. We live in a world that often dismisses the seriousness of sin, but the Bible is clear that disobedience to God has consequences. Yet, even in our failures, God's justice is not devoid of mercy. His desire is always to restore us, to bring us back into relationship with him, and to transform us into the people he has called us to be. As we reflect on the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, we are reminded that divine justice is not just about punishment. It is about correction, transformation, and the call to holiness. It is through God's justice that we learn to align our lives with his will, and it is through his mercy that we find restoration. The wilderness was a place of testing, but it was also a place of grace, a grace that would ultimately lead the Israelites to the promised land. As we reflect on the journey of the Israelites through the wilderness, we can't help but be struck by the powerful lessons that echo through time. The desert was not just a place of physical struggle for the Israelites. It was the place where their faith, obedience, and trust in God were tested and refined. It was a place where they learned that survival wasn't just about their own strength or ability. It was about surrendering to God, trusting in his provision, and recognizing the cost of disobedience. Through the miracles of the manna, the water from the rock, and the protection from the fiery serpents, God showed his love and mercy to his people. Yet his justice was also clear. He did not tolerate rebellion, idolatry, or a lack of trust in his plan. The Israelites were continually reminded that while God is loving and merciful, he is also holy and just. Their journey was one of transformation, a journey that required them to leave behind the ways of Egypt and embrace the new identity that God had for them. In our own lives, we too face moments of testing, seasons of doubt, hardship, and temptation. We may find ourselves walking through our own deserts, questioning God's provision, or turning to idols that promise fulfillment but only lead to emptiness. But just like the Israelites, we are called to trust in God's plan, to rely on his provision, and to remember that even in the most difficult of times, he is with us. Our faith may be tested, but it is through those tests that we are shaped into the people God has called us to be. The story of the Exodus reminds us that we are all on a journey, one that involves both the miracles of God's provision and the realities of our own weaknesses and failures. But it also shows us that, through it all, God is faithful. His justice and mercy are intertwined, and his desire is for us to grow in obedience, faith, and holiness. If you've been inspired by the journey of the Israelites, if you felt challenged to grow in your own faith and trust in God, I invite you to share your thoughts with us. What have you learned from this powerful story? How has God spoken to you through his justice, his mercy, and his faithfulness? We would love to hear your reflections and experiences in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to God's Advice. This channel is dedicated to bringing you insights, encouragement, and wisdom from God's Word to help you navigate life's challenges with faith and confidence. Don't miss out on more videos that will inspire and challenge you to grow in your relationship with God. Share this video with your friends and family, and let's spread the message of God's love, justice, and mercy together. Remember, you are never alone on this journey. Just as God was with the Israelites in the desert, he is with you today, guiding you, providing for you, and shaping you into the person he has destined you to be. So stay strong, trust in his plan, and always keep walking forward with faith. Thank you for joining us on God's Advice. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep seeking God's wisdom, and may his peace be with you.